I know I stand between you and drinks, so I'm going to try and make this informative, interesting, and quick as well. So just to kick off the presentation, risk scoring, we're all familiar with risk scoring. Banks have been doing risk scoring for since about the year 2000, and FATF mandated it in about 2007, taking a more risk-based approach. But what we haven't been doing is much more of a dynamic approach to risk scoring, and that's why sometimes compliance is seen as a blocker as opposed to a business advantage. For the compliance team to be valuable, a couple of things need to be true. So risks monitoring needs to be integrated with transaction monitoring. If these two things live in isolation, then you have one score which will never feed into another score, and you've got two siloed views of overall business risk, and you'll never have a unified understanding of your customers. Risk monitoring needs to be real time. I know that sounds kind of table stakes at this point, but a lot of organizations are only scoring people for risk at the point of onboarding, and then that static risk score is existing through their entire journey as a customer. And then risk scores must be forecastable. You must be able to present to the business and tell them what will happen if certain things are met, if certain geopolitical situations arise, if certain countries, for example, are added to a higher risk list. Then the business needs to know, what does that do to our risk profile? How many people are moved from medium risk to high risk, from low risk to medium risk? So all of these things kind of need to be true for the compliance team to be seen as a value add rather than a blocker to business success. So in terms of risk scoring is kind of seen as one of those things where transactions are secondary thoughts. So in terms of the risk scoring, when you start looking at transaction risk scoring, it's really important to take those initial risks that you found from the customer, you categorize them into easily digestible, low, medium, high risks, but then what do you actually do with them once you've managed to categorize their risk accordingly? A couple of things need to happen. So the rules that execute should be based on the customer's actual risk. You can't apply the same logic to a low-risk customer as you do to a high-risk customer. When you're looking at their transactions, you should very much be able to use their actual risk score. If they're a low-risk customer, you can start to think about what would their risk models look like. There's also been a tendency to have this one-size-fits-all model where all of the customers are treated as being the same, and once the customer has been onboarded, regardless of their risk profile, when you're looking at transaction monitoring, the fraud signals, the money laundering signals are all treated the same. And again, that's something that needs to change if the compliance team are to be treated as a value-add partner rather than someone who is consistently saying no to business requirements and changing business landscapes. And finally, the outcome of that transaction monitoring must be risk relevant. There's a nice illustration on the next screen. So if you have a low-risk customer, if that low-risk customer, if you're monitoring them for fraud patterns, if that low-risk customer sends a transaction of £1, that would be a tester transaction, and then they subsequently send a transaction of £500, that might absolutely be within their normal transaction patterns. However, if you have a high-risk customer, applying that same logic to them just doesn't make any sense to the business overall. So what you can do in that instance is segregate your customers by risk profiles and then start applying those risk-based thresholds to the customers. For example, a very high-risk customer, it might be abnormal for them to send £1 and then £100 subsequently. So that would then, again, reflect on their risk profile. And if you do that, the business is then able to work with customers that represent both levels of risk. But crucially, the low-risk customers can then be onboarded and treated accordingly. When you're actually taking an action off the back of the transaction rules as well, it should be risk relevant. So if a high-risk customer does an action and that's slightly outside of their risk remit, it might be that you flag the transaction rather than preventing the transaction. So for a very high-risk customer, you want to prevent that transaction. But for a low-risk customer, you could simply flag and then have something generated for an analyst to review rather than straight away preventing the transaction from going ahead. There's always an evolving risk landscape. Risks never stay static, even though sometimes we tend to score the customers at the point of onboarding and never revisit their risk profile. So to give an example, Rory this morning talked about the evolving landscape, and he talked about how sanctions are being implemented at a very short notice. The compliance team should be able to accurately articulate what happens to the overall business's risk profile if sanctions are applied to a particular country, as Trump is doing. He's just applying blanket sanctions to entire countries rather than taking a more fine approach. So having the ability to say, if a certain factor becomes true, what does that do to our risk profile? Can we then use that information to actually look at our customer base and apply certain logics to make sure that we're covered from a risk perspective? So risk levels should be updated. It's not good enough really just to mark someone as a PEP. If they're a PEP, then that should be reflective of how they're treated through their entire customer journey. Known risk factors, what you know about the customer, the type of business that they're in, the type of transactions that they said they would be doing with you, that should all be fed back into the risk scoring. And then lastly, criminals aren't stupid, but they are lazy and they are time constrained. So being able to apply hypervigilance to customers, if someone's been with you for 3 weeks and their patterns are very sporadic and transactions are all over the place, that's very different from a customer who's been with you for a year or for 2 years. And for the customers that have been with you for longer, you should be able to treat them differently. So applying the concept of hypervigilance is important as well, and being able to reflect how you treat a customer based on the signals that they've given you, micro and macro, is quite important as well. To move on, in order to achieve much more agile risk scoring, a couple of things need to happen, and this is a circle for a reason. So there needs to be a dynamic risk score that should be continually updated. It should never be finished. You should then be able to feed that dynamic risk score into your risk-based outcomes. If a customer transacts a certain amount with you, if their transaction goes above a certain threshold, you should be able to use the dynamic risk scoring in order to give you more fraud-relevant signals in whether or not that's something that's within the customer's expected patterns or outside of those patterns. And then that hypervigilance piece is really important because with your customer base, you will notice certain patterns, and those patterns should be reflected at the point of onboarding and not retrospectively once a fraudulent activity's happened or something's happened. If you're just saying, yeah, this keeps happening and you're doing nothing about it, then the compliance team aren't necessarily going to be seen as a value add to the business. The things that the business really wants to know are fairly simple. They want to know, can we take on more risk? What type of customers can we take on? For example, we know that we have X number of medium risk customers. What would happen if we were to take on an additional X percentage of medium risk customers? Businesses also want to know, if we operate in new markets, what's our risk profile? Can we transact with certain types of businesses? Can we move into certain markets? These are all fairly standard things that the business wants to know, but we often don't actually have any way of telling the business whether or not we can take on those risks. We know how many customers we have in a particular geography, but we don't know how many customers in that geography represent a certain risk based on their average transaction volumes and the like. We often want to do more with our existing customer base. Businesses, the largest cost at any point is generally the customer acquisition, the cost that it takes to get a customer through the door. Keeping that customer is often much cheaper, and growing that customer is much cheaper than procuring and going to market and finding new customers. So with those customers, how would we be able to grow the services that we offer to them. If we were to offer new services like remittance payments, what would that do to our overall risk? How many customers do we have in a particular geography who might take this service up? And overall, how risky are those customers at the moment? And then lastly, the business always, of course, wants to know if we take a certain action, can we accept new clients? Can we accept new clients from a particular geography? Can we accept business clients? Can we accept retail clients? And for a lot of organizations, it's not easy to be able to give that information. Yes, we have CRMs and we can run reports, but actually being able to forecast that information is quite difficult. So to give a visual representation of what forecasting would look like, on the left-hand side, you've got on your right, or your left, my right, you've got the customer risk assessment. So how many customers do we have in each bucket? The pastel bar is the after, and the solid colors are the before. So, for example, if we moved a certain parameter, say a particular country, to being representing a higher risk factor, so that if a country becomes sanctioned or if they move around the FATF high-risk countries, then what would that do to our overall risk profile? In this instance, for example, it wouldn't be a huge amount of change, but the customers that are in low would be spread between very low and medium. It wouldn't affect our high and our very high risk customers. And the other score you're seeing, the TRS, the transaction risk score, being able to understand if we take on certain types of transactions or if we designate a certain type of transaction as previously being low risk and we move it into medium risk, what would that do to our overall transaction risk score as well? So again, you've got the before and the after there, and we can see that, for example, if you were to increase the payment threshold from, say, £2,000 to £4,000, what would that do to our transactions? Well, it would move a certain percentage of our transactions from being low risk to being medium risk, and ever so slightly impact our high risk transactions as well. So having the ability to forecast these then means you can have those conversations with the business. If someone, again, if someone from the business or the board ask you a question, having the ability to move those toggles around, forecast the information and present it back to the board is really what it's about, and it's really how compliance becomes value add, again, rather than someone who's seen as often being a blocker to business growth. So compliance are seen as naysayers, but they really are the last line of defense. They do stand between a business losing significant amounts of money, especially when it comes to things like APP fraud, but they are very much important to the overall success of the business. And if we didn't have them, criminals would not rest. They would take full advantage of those gaps in our services. So to summarize, for a compliance team to be valuable, certain things need to be true. So the business risk levels need to be relevant. They need to be risk relevant. They also need to be flexible. They need to be integrated, and they need to be forecastable. So if you don't have that ability to move those toggles and really highlight whether or not something that the business plans to do impacts the risk landscape, again, compliance are going to be seen as naysayers rather than people who are adding value to the overall business success. Risk-based actions need to be relevant. So again, if a customer's been with you for 3 years, they've never shown any signs of fraud, you've never had to submit a suspicious activity report in all of that time, they have earned the right to be treated differently from someone who's just signed up to you, who's been with you for 3 weeks, and their patterns are all over the place. So those actions should be relevant. If you want to take an action, it should be within the scope of how you want to treat that customer. If they're low risk, you can very much create an alert. However, if they're high risk, you can block the transaction altogether. And again, that really gives you the ability to add value back to the business. The micro and macro risks need to be factored in. It's quite important that you really do understand what the customer's doing. If they are calling you up and changing their email address just before they make a large transaction, that's very risk relevant. If they're calling you and telling you that they've got a new phone number, they manage to update that information, and suddenly they're withdrawing 70% of the funds in their account, again, that's very risk relevant. Whereas what we tend to do is just look at that customer, and we tend to look at what they're doing as a customer independent of what their transactions are doing and how their money's moving. So being able to use those micro and macro risks within the overall business is important. And then lastly, being able to forecast those risks. If the business ever comes to you and says, well, how do I know I can move into this market, or what does moving into this business segment mean for me and mean for our business, we should be able to give them that answer. Because if we can't give them that answer, again, the question is, are you just saying no for the sake of saying no, or do you actually have some data to back up whether or not we can take on certain types of new processes in order to factor in risks? Cool. With that being said, I do genuinely believe that compliance doesn't hinder, it fortifies the business. It is the part of the business that can really solidify longevity and can really deliver the overall value to customers and end users as well. With that, we do have a couple of minutes if there's any questions in the room. If not, we can move on to the panel. No, I answered everyone's questions. Cool. Okay. I didn't mention AI once. I'm not going to ask for a round of applause just for that, but I will hand over now. Thank you.